I'm delighted to welcome you all here to the City Assembly House for the conference, Dublin 2025, a city in crisis or a golden opportunity, which the Irish Georgian Society and Dublin Civic Trust have organised with the aim of exploring the challenges and opportunities facing Dublin's historic core. Today we will hear speakers talk on a wide range of subjects that will include planning, architecture, built heritage protection, sustainability and wider social policy, which together will highlight the enormous complexities of urban management and the multitude of stakeholders involved. It's hoped that these presentations and the discussions arising from them will help in formulating a new vision for the city in which heritage conservation will play a central role. Both the Irish Georgian Society and the Dublin Civic Trust have a long history of championing the protection of Dublin's built heritage through educational and advocacy programmes and through supporting and undertaking building conservation projects. In the case of the Irish Georgian Society, we have assisted conservation initiatives throughout the city through our small grant scheme and in collaboration with Dublin City Council in the restoration of this building we're in today, the Dublin City Assembly House, built in the 1760s by the Society of Artists in Ireland as the first purpose-built, publicly accessible art gallery in Ireland or Britain, or possibly on a broader European basis. That subsequent to that, it served as a city hall, an official city hall for the first half of the 19th century, then as a courthouse. Then for the second half of the 20th century was home to the Dublin Civic Museum, which closed in 2003. The building was empty for a 10-year period, at which point in time the Irish Georgian Society started its collaboration with the City Council. Through its revolving building fund mechanism, Dublin Civic Trust has fully restored a number of architecturally significant buildings around the city, given its support to others. Most notably, the Trust is currently undertaking a magnificent restoration of its premises in number 18 up Ormond Quay Upper, an 18th century merchant's house that had been in a state of significant disrepair before its acquisition by the Trust. The first phase of the restoration of the building has been completed at this point in time. If you have not yet seen it, I encourage you to do so at your soonest opportunity. Before proceeding start, I wish to take a moment to thank the National Built Heritage Service and the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage for the support it has given to the delivery of this conference, and also to thank the Heritage Council for the assistance it provides to both the Irish Georgian Society and to the Dublin Civic Trust. The idea of holding this conference originated in the Irish Georgian Society's Architectural Conservation and Planning Committee, but its delivery, its organisation, has been done through enormous efforts of Emmeline Henderson, the Irish Georgian Society Conservation Manager and Assistant Director, and Graham Hickey, the CEO of Dublin Civic Trust, both of whom I would like to thank at this point in time, because I'm conscious that we're going to be very tight in time throughout the whole of the day. So I look forward to being for a conference that the two of you have done so much to bring about. Some logistics. The fire escape routes are through the front door, but also through an emergency exit over here. Remembering everybody to turn off their mobile phones, out any alarms you might have on your mobile phone, which I'm always guilty of not doing. The first coffee break will be at 11:15. It's going to be served at the back of the room. Lunch is at 1:15. It's going to be served in the first floor room. It's provided through Sprout. I'm told that 1/3 of the options are vegan, so if you wish to have vegan food, make sure you race to the front, but don't stampede. I think we're getting close to starting. Regrettably, we have heard from the Lord Mayor's office that the Lord Mayor of Dublin, Emma Blaine, is no longer available to join us, but she has sent her regrets. She very much wished to be here for the start of today's conference. Now, finally, the first session of today's conference will consider Dublin past and present, where we were, why we are. And I'm very pleased to be in a position to introduce our keynote speaker, Valerie Mulvin, whose talk will be on the subject of the future of the past, project of recovery, Niall McCullough's Dublin, an urban history, and Dublin creation, occupation, destruction. Valerie is a co-founder of McCullough Mulvin Architects, a Dublin practice focused on design of sustainable culture, educational and civic buildings, with an interest in innovative contemporary architecture, place and history. McCullough Mulvin's award-winning buildings in Ireland and internationally include Trinity Long Room Hub, Dublin Dental School and Hospital, Waterford Fire Station, Butler Gallery, Medieval Mile Museum, Printing House Square Student Housing, and the Learning Laboratory at Calbar University, India. Her work is extended by publications, teaching and research, and has been exhibited internationally. Her book, Approximate Morphology of Irish Towns, discusses the origin, originality and potential of towns and town plans in Ireland. And this research currently forms part of a national touring exhibition, The Reasons of Town, a collaboration with the Irish Architecture Foundation. Valerie is a member of Donough. Valerie.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Yeah. I can think of nobody who'd prefer to be here than Niall McCullough himself to be doing this, so I'm really standing in his shoes. He would be very much relishing this debate and how he could play a part in it. And I hope you'll hear his words actually as I talk through some of the thoughts in his two books. Niall first published Dublin and Urban History. I think that's too much actually. Is it too echoey? No? In 1989, not so long after we'd published A Lost Tradition, when Dublin was really a very damaged place, he completely revised the text and the design and the images in 2007, which was 18 years later, to reflect the change in the city itself and as a response to the explosion of economy and society. And as a result of that, decayed fabric was being mined out of the city, extensive development had filled in the gaps, and he wrote, "The labyrinthine layers of meaning embedded in the city plan, itself an artifact, are vanishing without trace." That was 2007, and how much have we lost since then? Another 18 years on. So when the book set out to dissect the structure of the city, to create an understanding of overlapping buildings and development, through Dublin's history, which shaped the city we've inherited, his was always the approach of an architect, a mix of idealism and pragmatism. And I love that he starts this book with an advertisement, and I quote, Stationers' Hall, Cork Hill, 1731. In a warm room with a good fire, from 9 in the morning till 8 p.m, a painting by Raphael, and several fleas affixed by gold chains. So that's as original as Dublin always is, just the fabulous juxtaposition of wild things put together. Then he gets into practicalities, demonstrating exactly what we now recognise as the historic city. 18th century estates and 19th century works and interventions have always shoehorned themselves into spaces left by earlier decisions. When it came to writing Dublin Creation, Occupation, Destruction, he set out to write a different kind of book. The river on the cover, heading north-south rather than east-west, maybe summarises it. For him, it was to be no less analytical, but analytical in a different way, about different things, elusive and alive to atmosphere, to fabric, to materials, and how they were used. And he was determined that the book would be defined by its startling images. So the space between these two books is made up of the ammunition of his whole life, of thinking, of looking, of comparing, of piling things up and being bound by nobody. Books were always parallel to buildings in his life. There was a continual conversation between the two, a complete symbiosis of his interest in the character and originality of this city and how we could hold on to that, to read the clues hidden below the plastic windows and the cement render, to recover what it had once been. So why are these books important? I would say each contributes something to today's debate. Can we work on multiple projects of recovery, which would capture something of what we've already lost and guide us as to how to intervene in the city plan? The first book sets a framework we shouldn't ignore, a rationale behind city streets and quarters. If we obliterate them, we should do it because we're putting back something better. That's rarely the case, but it's not impossible. So the first book is really structure, how, why. The second book reminds us that the material quality of what we're seeing, or what we failed to see at the time when it could have been saved, is unique, unrepeatable, and can be lost through carelessness, ignorance, boredom. He carefully reconstructs lost spaces, sometimes whole quarters of the city, in much the way Joyce does in Ulysses. And like that book, you could recreate the quality of the city in your imagination by using these images. Sometimes the buildings are anonymous in themselves, but they're freighted with literary associations or historical events. So if many of these are gone, we have to fix on what's left as really significant. So the second book is really affinities, who, where. So Dublin and Urban History. In his introduction to the second edition, he said, Dublin was one of Europe's largest cities in the 18th century, but it's never really been studied for its potential contribution to the history of European urbanism. The book is first about its physical structure, an exploration of the city plan over time, how early marks of movement or ownership became a layered tissue of meaning. The greatest expression of this palimpsest remains the Georgian city plan, a series of autonomous classical urban fragments adjusted to an underlying historical and geographical structure. Second, the book is about change. It documents the tradition of evolution at the macro and micro level. So public space, axes, interventions at a large scale, continuity of scale and use, like Hogan Green becoming College Green. It's a series of linear axes rather than major urban spaces. And third, it studies the building blocks that make up the city, from major institutions and churches to the single house. But his personal relationship to the city is also part of the narrative. His obsession with the Dublin he grew up in. So the subterranean memory he describes of bullet-perforated breasts and chipped masonry against the vicarious enjoyment of the tissue of decayed fabric. So he talks about the relationship of history and literature to that context and the remorseless change and disappearance of the meaning of the city. Crucially, the book isn't an academic study, although it stands on the shoulders of all preceding research, but it is a catalogue of disappearing resources. It's something that's intended by underlying the weight of ideas in the city plan and fabric, and could inform debate about future directions and act as a design resource for work taking place within it, and that is still the case. So to make a few points about the structure of the city, to test out where we are now, I'll mention some of his observations on the moments of its urban growth. The real structure of the city, the junction of the Schlige from all over the country, in concert with maybe one or two centres, all clear at Thomas Street. I'll just point out some of these now. Oh, hang on. And also Dublin, the Black Pool, and possibly an early Christian enclosure just around Danger Street. They're potent generative forms. And he identifies a place where these routes cross. And it's not where you'd think. It's not at the hill of Christchurch and the castle, the hinge of the Viking city. It's not at the Liffey, but it's at Cross Poddle, and I'll try and point that out here on this. It's right there. And this fundamental armature, he notes, has no protection or recognition in the city plan. And that's one of the very crucial points that this book makes, the persistence of the plan from earliest times on. So he reminds us of the seam, which you can still read, between the medieval city and the Viking city, and its extension into the medieval port, the infilling of the river shallows, approximately along the line of Cook Street. But when you look at a picture, an early photograph of St. Auden's Arch, the gate in the original Viking North Wall, which became embedded in Cook Street, and compare it with what's there now, it's clear we've lost something in translation. It's not saying you have to hold everything in aspic, but through not tending to the weight and meaning of elements, their memory has been abandoned. Knowing where monuments are was important for now. You would think it's impossible for monuments to disappear, but that's not so at all. There were over 30 medieval cathedrals, churches and chapels. Only 3 of those now survive complete. I don't know if you can see on this map, but the place marked U, which is down here, St. Michael le Pole. Most people in this room would know of it, and not only is it gone, but there's absolutely nothing to indicate it was ever there. What if somebody had designed a beautiful and usable vertical tower as part of that scenography of the site? And so these medieval church towers are ones that are now left as fragments. The Reformation and the Tudors separate the medieval from the modern city. There's a change of religion. Here, there's a transfer of monastic lands, and that's very important because these lands tended to become the boundaries of the future Georgian estates. So this is St. Thomas Court, made over into a fashionable Jacobean mansion. But Niall really describes the city as being essentially refounded in 1660. with the restoration of Charles II, and the incredibly productive years between this date and 1820 define our view of what the city is now. And that was given meaning and direction to the, if I just go back to the speed map for a second, the Viceroy really did, the Duke of Ormond, changed a lot of things by taking what was essentially the medieval city and turning it into something else, or beginning that turn, by initiating the development of the Royal Hospital and the Phoenix Park, and generally creating a climate for speculative development, which also encouraged people like Sir Humphrey Jervis to develop his quarter north of the river, and the city's development of Smithfield here. So each quarter of the city in the book is meticulously analysed, starting with the north side here in Smithfield, which was an initiative of the city itself, and on the sloblands between high and low tides, the quays began to be developed as a coherent way of drawing the plan together, and this is Francis Place's drawing of Arran Quay. In parallel with that, the city was also developing Stephen's Green as a fashionable plaza with houses around it, and that's only 50 years after Place Royale, or the Place des Vosges in Paris, was being developed. So really innovative things going on. 4 useful maps that he uses to define Georgian growth between 1660 and 1750. First, de Gam's map and Thomas Phillips, and then followed by Brooking's map and Roke's map. A structure made, in other words, and then backfilled with development. So here, Smithfield, you can see, and the Jervis estate, whose 9 squares, if I just go back here, are delineated with a square in the centre with a church in the middle of it. And then the Moore estate, which became part of the Gardner estate later. And things like New Row in the Liberties, which were built in, I suppose you'd call, an Anglo-Dutch style, is part of that first phase of explosive development. But to talk about the way estates were put together, here are 2 interesting analytical drawings from the book. On the right, development circles around the old city in the centre. It's a magnetic pull that holds everything in its gravitational force, and on the left, and slightly pulled apart for clarity, the estates and landholdings which became the recognisable environments of today. And his clear description of how estates were made is essential to an understanding of how the city maintained its loose uniformity, very different to Bath or Edinburgh, and it allowed it to make adjustment to existing features like the old city and the various monuments that existed. Leases maintained standards to a degree as to height and materials, and I quote, "There was a fine balance of financial risk and the existence of a 3-tiered hierarchy: landowner, speculator, lessee. Textbook operation required a landowner to lay out an urban quarter on his land with the help of a surveyor, and then lease plots on it with terms to building speculators for a number of years at a specific ground rent. Speculators, frequently master builders, and there was no stigma in this work, then built houses, usually 2 or 3 together, and sold them, lease and ground rent included, to a willing public who held them for the time specified. So the landowner acquired ground rent and the expectation of the endless renewal of assets as the leases fell in. The builder had quick access to good sites at a cheap rate, and the lessee was offered choice and a flexibility unusual even today. So that's a few clues for us all, I suppose. It's a simplification of a very complex land leaseholding system where many landowners didn't actually own the land freehold at all, but themselves leased the land. So things could change, they could overheat, things could go belly up overnight, and that's a situation very familiar to many of us architects who've been living through the last 20 years. So the streets were aligned, but were governed by plot maximisation rather than architectural intent. The downside of the leasehold approach was poor construction, obviously, because houses were built to last only as long as the leases. Originally that was 40 years, then it became 60, and later 99. But effectively the street became the prime fixture rather than the buildings, and we seem to have inherited that approach. So here's the main street of the Ainger estate. Between 1660 and 1885, Sir Francis Ainger, who held the lands of Whitefriars Monastery, and you'll remember that small circular structure in the city, one of potentially an early Christian enclosure. He developed an estate by the absolute simplest of means, taking the oval landholding, right here, and just bisecting it with one straight street. And that was once the grandest street in Dublin. It was 60 foot wide. So it was mathematical, it was profitable, it was plots first, architecture later, and that's not so different to now. But they managed a lot of coherence. And then the book continues with the developments east of the city, Stephen's Green, Dame Street, Temple Bar, the lands of Tib and Tom, the Dawson and the Molesworth estate. And these early 18th century developments in small pockets like this, it's like the building we now work in, which is Molesworth Street, and this building in Fenian Street, which actually predates the houses on Merrion Square. This is one of our projects of recovery. This first picture is from 1953, when it was a fully functioning tenement house with a general store on the ground floor, photographed by Neville Johnson, an English artist who worked in Dublin for a time and who was brilliantly funded by the Arts Council to record Dublin's people and places in photographs, a hugely important record. This is the near derelict condition of the building which we took over in 2017 for a client. It looks completely gone, and this is it now in its final completion, which Niall never fully saw. And we built a building at the back which funded what was going on at the front. And those tiny fragments, I think, are really worthy of our attention and recovery. And then you move on to the scale and grandeur of the Gardiner and the Fitzwilliam estates, the ambitious plan here of the Gardiner estate, gathering roots in and through and resolving them in a flourish with the circus up at the top here, which was, of course, never built. But it was a question of putting parcels of land together and making development lots out of them, much as developers do today. So this is Mountjoy Square, but the wonderful architectural brilliance of this is that offset that you see as you come up the top of Gardiner Street. So pulling, as the architect did, the gesture of the buildings forward to close the corner as the street processes up the hill. It's a really distinctive urban gesture of huge ambition and subtlety. And then the less elaborate Merrion Square, laid out by James Ensor as a long rectangle. From a very urban point of view, it's a very important street and square, as we know, but isn't it interesting that it just misses the axis of Kildare House, now Leinster House, which had been set out earlier. And finally, how all these partial fragments were connected by the work of the Wide Streets Commissioners, who over an extended period of time, with vision and drive, made the city that we now understand. Here is the cutting through to derive an appropriate place for the Custom House, making Beresford Place right here around the Custom House. And then developing corners and terminations that work in exactly the same way as Haussmann did in Paris. So in other words, these are like sutures for the cuts and sometimes brutal improvements that were made by cutting through medieval and later fabric. But when you make a new facade of quality and integrity, the damage seems somehow much mitigated. And the long elevations of uniformity and height and agreement of values, I think it's possible we can learn a lot from this. The coherence and understanding and tidying up after an intervention is what they mainly did. So this is, for example, Christchurch to St. Patrick's to Christchurch and to the Quays. And what they did was to cut a series of streets that went down, but as they cut things off, they made new facades, which really have given us that kind of coherence and really strong interventions into the medieval fabric. And then the final section in that book is Niall's analysis of the house, building block of the city. And this is a typological study of many house types. There's just a few of them here. There's thousands of them at home, bits of biro drafted on bits of paper as he went about his work. But he analysed hundreds of houses, fronts, backs, sides, surveyed them from rooftop to basement. And while public buildings and monuments can often be their focus, his real interest is in documenting and describing the ingenuity of the various plan forms. So the adjustment to conditions like the size of the plot, pre-existing neighbours, how corners are turned, how gardens and mews are managed, the huge importance of the anonymous, the humble as well as the grand, in making up walls of the streets we've inherited and which create their own coherence. And this is all to do with the market, where the scale could be brought up or down to give grandeur or coherence or to the smallest plot and maybe hauteur to the largest. So when you get to O'Connell Street after the Rising, a wartime act Dublin had little experience of, then over the next 10 years it was built again in modern materials to the same street plan and with general agreement as to the civic values that the street was to share. And that, I think, is part of that whole message of his first book, the extraordinary development of the city and how each year, each era has adjusted to the things that came afterwards. And if you look at the map at the bottom, which is the map of an enlargement of this 19th century map, you can see that the great widenings of streets that took place even then in the end of the 19th century or the mid-19th century do things like they make this gracious gesture of St. Michael's Circus around the end as you're coming around the end of Christchurch. And that's a really important finesse of architectural design, which happens much less now than it did then. And I suppose that book is both exemplar and warning. In his last book, Dublin, Creation, Occupation, Destruction, he writes, "At the end of the Second World War, in a world inured to widespread destruction, the city of Dublin stood poor, materially exhausted, but substantially intact. The particular quality of that city is hard to recapture today. Its impact lay in its scale, its fragile integrity, in the worn materiality of acres of old brick houses sheltering vivid social exchange. Between the end of the war and the end of the 20th century, this city was substantially destroyed. Where context is dislocated, meaning is dislodged. Describing its trajectory becomes less like architectural history, more art or opera. Dublin's elusive originality of place is composed of the city that was made, then the unintended way it was used, then how it was destroyed. Creation, occupation, destruction." And those are the three essays of the book, each one, for people who aren't familiar with its structure, scaffolded, you might say, with a lengthy photo essay. There's an introduction, and I've added a postscript because he left the book unfinished when he died, and I had to try and both find the photographs, locate them, because half the time I didn't know where they were, and most people wouldn't. I identified many of them with the help of people in this room, and got it into production with the designer. It was a very pleasurable and healing task. So, tracing that trajectory, he starts Creation with two maps, the Nolly map of Rome, where we lived for a year after we graduated, and the Roke map of Dublin, where we lived after that. And the contrasts are instructive. Nolly frames city plans to identify streets and squares. Public space includes the interiors of the public buildings. Roke represents the outline of every single structure in the city, the assembled property of individuals, representing thousands of individual agreements. And that's reached with a very elastic attitude to space, proportion, and materials. So the book suggests that these measured and relatively harmonious decisions make the city into a work of the Enlightenment. Nolly's map, which includes the shadow of what's underneath, suggested a way of reading Roke. The Nolly map has the archaeology of the city, visible in a sort of floating sea of urbanity. Roke's map settles the Georgian city over the stubborn armature of what was still evident, the old city, the network of routes, the river and the ridge, Oxman Town on the other bank. And against these old routeways, he defines a syncopated view of the trajectory of the city, distilled down to four transformative engines of development. And they are the residential estates, public infrastructure or the quays, the university, and the wide streets commissioners. So with these few elements, he redescribes the city with economy, like a series of grace notes, because he's already done the work in the first book. Geography sets up some of these floating elements around which growth settled. This is Kevin Street, and it is part of the ridge that I described, the line from Cross Poddle through James's Street to the sea. And that proves fruitful as a lens. You'd hardly recognise this as an aerial photograph of Kevin Street, with its triangular marketplaces here and here, back to back. And then the four engines of development, the residential estates, their anonymity, the thousands of houses piled on top of each other, making up the texture of the city. Demonstrating, by the way, his clear preference for the imagination of Gardner over what he called the frigid mansions of Fitzwilliam Square. Public infrastructure, or the quays, the precision and the quality of the sharp geometry of granite in the service of engineering is the focus here on the quays, opening up and making coherent that logic that Ormond started in the 1660s. Then the university, and this is a film still from his film Ariel that he made for Open House in 2020, when the pandemic made it impossible for us to visit anything. He discussed Dublin again there as a work of the Enlightenment, because at its centre was not a palace, not a park, but a university. And that was bound up in the work we were doing at the time, making the first new square in Trinity College 200 years, just behind the printing house. And that chapter on creation lingers on the clarity conferred by the Wide Streets Commissioners, the plans here of where Sackville Mall debouches onto the quays over Carlisle Bridge. And I think there wouldn't even be many people in this room who would recognise that shallow crescent where Carlisle Bridge meets the south side. So the essays in creation and the photography set the scene. It's an introduction to the next essay, Occupation. And his interest here is in the ephemeral qualities, which are more difficult to capture, mainly because they no longer exist in their original form. So he spent years, because he spent years on this book, looking into plate negatives and murky images of unidentified places that nobody knew where they were, to fill in the gaps in his visual picture of the city. And then, armed with his own maps, he would go out and walk area by area to see if the surroundings that were visible in those photographs, spires, walls, outlines, would release a secret and identify a lost corner. In trying to make a three-dimensional reconstruction of lost space, his architect's eye was constantly alive to context and to the Walter Benjamin-like possibility that the ghosts we can reconstruct might lend weight to a discourse on the city into the future. So Occupation here, this part of the book, is scored through with a sense of the people who inhabited this city. It's a sort of a full circle from Niall's earliest memories of visiting very destitute areas of Dublin with his mother bringing meals. He recalled visiting the debtors' prison, for example, when it was still used for housing, remembering old men waiting for their dinner with the table set, or others in much more difficult conditions of disarray. He was profoundly influenced by having seen the very end of those interiors he locates in this Occupation chapter. But this opening image describes the city with people everywhere, looking out of windows with intent, a city of people held in space. But the key to what he was interested in here is what he cropped out of this image. So this is the plumes, the horses, the crowds. It's O'Donovan Ross's funeral in 1915. It took me a very long time to find out what it was. But he was focused in this chapter not on the funeral, not on the event, but on the intensity of occupation of the city. So he cut away all the irrelevant detail to focus on the people in the windows occupying the city by their occupation of space. There's also a keen awareness in this chapter of the glaring contrast between a middle-class, complacent 19th century Dublin, full of the law, religion and trade, counterpointed by tenements stuffed full of people in once grand houses, screening equally overpopulated rookeries in back streets, alleys and courts, as the city slides downhill after the Act of Union. It's an increase of material complexity, squeezing additional uses into arrested fabric in ways never considered by its visionaries. There were families in every room. Everything was let and sublet. There was little sanitation, little maintenance. This is 44 York Street, the stairs, the parallel world of the slums, which was exacerbated, of course, after the famine, with people pouring in from the countryside looking for anywhere to live and work. So there are dirty yards of photographs full of children and washing, photographed as a phenomenon, sharpening further as fine houses on streets and squares are abandoned and let out by the room to increasing numbers of people. And that idea of photography as an art form burgeoning in parallel to this integration of the city is something Niall was very precise about. If you look at this Fox Talbot pillar, how the first tentative empty images, and they're all empty because they're very long exposures, these slowly become replaced in the record by multiple pictures of the Dublin slums. This is Chancery Lane, and people have been brought out to be photographed in order to record the numbers that live in a single house. This is an amazing idea, the obvious comparison with Naples, a beautiful bay, an exhausted city, jammed with people, but it was celebrated by the likes of Dickens visiting Dublin, and I quote, heartily recommending, "To all lovers of picturesque Catholicity, by no means to omit a walk in the Coombe." And that really is the equivalent of slum tourism today. The materiality of these photographs tell an analogous story. Stairs being worn down to knots in the timber, layers of paint and wallpaper holding it all together. He's as astounded by the statistics as he's interested in the expressions of people taken out of their houses and photographed. There could be hundreds of people living on a street. It's documented with extraordinary clarity by Jacinta Prunty in her book on the Dublin slums. He's also fascinated by the backdrop to their lives, the clocks, the bedsteads, equally alive to the aesthetic qualities of these spare, minimal, scuffed surfaces and broken fragments. This is Cuff Street staircase on the left, and in Fitzgibbon Street, bird cages fixed to classical columns. Again, it's the juxtaposition, it's like Raphael and the Fleas. And the city was also a container for celebration as well as habitation. This is full, not empty, and many images he put together are just humming with life. This is people acting together for the Eucharistic Congress in 1933. And here's a picture of O'Connell Bridge, absolutely jam-packed with people. And again, very hard to find out what event this was, but I did eventually. It's the night Ireland was declared a republic in 1949. So again, it's people occupying space. People write from what they know, and literature as a source was very potent for this book. Sheridan Le Fanu's novels, among others, gave Niall reliable and intriguing evidence of the imaginative and useful cutting about to repurpose brick walls and hack about rooms all over the city all the time. House in a Churchyard mentions a house on Blind Quay, and I quote, "A dusty, dreary, wainscoted old house, indeed 2 houses intermarried, with doors broken through the partition walls, the floors not of a level, joined by steps up and down, and having 3 great staircases." So Niall was constantly alive to the palimpsest and intervention that those kind of books described, whether in the imagination or in a photographic plate, like this one of Lipton's to-be department store on Dame Street, having huge windows carved into its facade, which of course speaks of a desperate yearning for modernity, for change, and you can see the people in this hoarding looking through the hoarding just to see what the hell is going on. Or this insurance map from about 1906, which gives a fascinating picture of how Dublin was beginning to assess fire risk in areas of entertainment, like the Empire Palace Theatre, which is now the Olympia, right there. Think of Paris at the same time, or 20 years previously, the renditions of people out enjoying themselves in paintings by, say, Renoir. Despite their poverty and difficult circumstances, the joy of it, the music halls, the theatres, speaking of an urban population of limited means, but capacity for much enjoyment. So occupation is an essay in how spaces form and reform, how they wear down until they wear out, but how they retain a sense of themselves and manage, in defiance of physics, to contain a multiplicity of lives and uses. And we should value that. Moving to the last chapter and quoting, "Dublin was destroyed with furious intent in the 1960s and 70s, with a gradually slowing rate thereafter, like the pattern of a rainstorm." So that was a long process with no one exact cause. Slum clearance caused honourable but unfortunate casualties to so much built fabric in the early years of this state, but other factors beyond the need to rehouse people, like war, the call for roads, a yearning for modernity that I've mentioned, a vindictive sense of otherness, of Georgian terraces as signifiers of a different sort of occupation, housing and danger, real or perceived, which is like the rainy spring that caused the collapse of a house in Fenian Street in June 1963, and as a result there happened the demolition of about 1,200 houses by Dublin Corporation as people were sleeping in the streets out of terror, and even later again out of boredom or carelessness. But in this slide here, I remember Niall's absolute delight in discovering this extraordinary 1965 film clip of Anthony Burgess, who was a Joyce fanatic. He was surveying here in disbelief the actual ruins of number 7 Eccles Street. And the film that this was a film called Silence, Exile, Cunning, made by Jonathan Miller for the BBC. And it involved many libations and minor bribes to secure access to the building in 7 Eccles Street from the workmen who were taking the house apart. Joyce's real location for the fictional Bloom House has a double layering that Niall absolutely adored, the weight of meanings with no physical presence, but yet they register in the mind of the city. And this is now gone, with only fragments installed in various houses in North Great George's Street. War, in fact, was a comparatively minor earlier player. This image was taken in the aftermath of the Rising of May in 1916 with a knowing eye to its representational chaos by the antiquarian T.J. Westrop. For Niall, as an architect, these photographs are yet another fascinating way to study how the city's buildings were put together, and more interesting still, how they came apart under stress. The accuracy of firepower created complete ruin adjacent to fully intact window displays. But even this is, of course, beautiful, and he describes it like an experiment in the effect of metallic violence, like the ruined cities of Flanders. There are 3 wonderful images here of the forecourts after the deliberate destruction of memory caused by the Civil War, and the wonderful vision of T.J. Byrne, who was the head of the Board of Works at the time, persuading Cosgrave, the Taoiseach, that these could be rebuilt and not taken down. That was a remarkable, prescient and incredibly advanced exercise in reconstruction after warfare. And I wonder, are there lots of clues for us in where we go now? Roads, the Achilles heel of Dublin right through to the 1990s. Again, the urge to modernity, even as early as the last quarter of the 19th century, thinking big for large numbers of people traversing the city every day. Here, this is Bindenblood Stoney's project from 1877, doubling the width of O'Connell or Carlisle Bridge. And it's symptomatic of a desire to sweep away tiny things, to have a grand, simple, silver bullet answer to any problem. Not much has changed. There is an unwillingness today to deal successfully with the small-boned grain of the existing city. Hence the manufacture of yet more government agencies to deal with the housing crisis. Dublin has always had a housing problem, of more people arriving than can be accommodated, but the answers have to be incremental, many and complex. They're slow, demanding of a strong vision with people to implement it, and craft skills which are in short supply. And that's a process generally not responsive to political expedience. It's clear what we've put aside for the sake of traffic. On the left, this is an image of Wormwood Gate, where the medieval city connected to the roads coming in from the west. And then on the right, the Google map, which just has to put a pin because the whole space of the Wormwood Gate has disappeared. So that's a traffic interchange rather than a space of materials and quality. But there were always people interested. Sorry, I've just lost my track here for a minute. Yes, in 1958, in Dominic Street, there's the poignant and tragic images of demolition brick by brick, with an exodus of people and prams, giving Dublin the air of post-war Berlin. They're akin to a description of Sebald's natural history of destruction. And you can see these images here, absolutely extraordinary. Or people like Paddy Healy, photographer, who used to record buildings before and after. He'd record them before they were taken down, and then afterwards. That's Great Longford Street, the last 2 Dutch billies in the city. It's disappointing there's still not anything like enough protection for buildings that we can't appreciate yet because they're covered with cement and mortar and bad windows. Eleanor Wiltshire, another great photographer with an eye to juxtaposition, interested in recording the outrageous destruction of fabric. And she wasn't unique in this. It was happening to great streets and small streets at the same time. And I'll rush now because I'm finishing up. A fascinating account of site assembly, the CPO map for the civic offices. When you see what went from the beautiful corporation yard, and then the really enigmatic oddness of the structure above it, which is Hackett's Racket Court. I can't tell you any more about it than that, but it's absolutely fascinating. But then the inevitable destruction of the Viking city underneath it. How on earth was there such a possibility of making civic offices in the wrong place, despite all our marches? By the 70s and 80s, Dublin was a city of flying shores. And in the records of the Dangerous Buildings Department of Dublin Corporation are a sure indication that whatever was photographed was demolished. And you can actually reconstruct these streets from the record. And Niall, here in this image, has put together a load of those pictures to record what Dorset Street was. And he returns to Dorset Street and York Street indeed again and again. This is Dorset Street with a plank in it. And this is very much about the public realm beginning to invade the private space of houses and streets. Or it's very opposite, excluding people by blocking up the windows and doors, the soul of the street. And you can see when that happens what results. And this image, just when places are inhabited, the difference between them and what you see in that image there. People to the left of the door. This is 4 Dominic Street, which is incidentally and completely typically the birthplace of Arthur Griffith, now gone, unrecognised. And I just wanted to add one last point, that these are books which see Dublin through the mind of an architect. To me, this last image is the angel of history. It's a picture that he wanted to put in the book of the 1916 image of the College of Surgeons in the week of the Easter Rising. It contains the idea, though, of soldiers on the Reichstag in 1945, or Walter Benjamin's Angel of History, which is, as you know, a Paul Klee painting where the Angel of History turns his back to the past, turns his face to the past, but is being propelled into the future by a storm that Benjamin calls progress. So I'll finish there, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Valerie, for so masterfully setting the scene for today's conference. You've got a great sense of the shape of the city, its fabric, its character, the people that occupy the city, what we had and what we have left, and hopefully now, through the remainder of the day, we can have further discussion of how things can be captured, protected, and improved upon. And I'm delighted to introduce our second speaker this morning, Owen, who is going to be talking with us on the subject of working in, with, and for a historic city. Owen is acting city architect in Dublin City Council, leading the city's architect division. This division operates as a design practice within the City Council, providing architectural and urban design services for housing, regeneration and civic projects. And as an RIAI Grade 1 accredited conservation practice, works to conserve the city's historic buildings and places. Owen led the writing of the city's first public realm strategy in 2012. He is a graduate of TU Dublin and holds an MSc in urban design from the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL. He has previously taught both architecture and urban design at the Bartlett School of Architecture, Kensington University, and TU Dublin.
Thanks very much, and thank you, Valerie, for that amazing exposition there. And thank you to the Georgian side for the invitation to speak, and the Civic Trust. And it's an incredible gathering here today of people, plenty of people I've collaborated with or worked with in the past, and a lot of people who've also inspired me in the past. That's just a personal note. But anyway, so I just wanted to talk about, I was invited to speak about the work that the City Council is doing in the city. Obviously the City Council's brief is very broad, and the built environment is a key part of that, but it's also a significant number of services around the city. And where do I point this out? I'll just use this. So obviously Valerie mentioned touched on the low point of the perception of the historic city and the governing organisations' attitudes to it. And things have come a long way since then. And I'm sort of showing this slide because I just wanted to talk about how the perceptions have changed so much, and I have to pay a debt to Nikki Matthews, who's here, because during my time working with Nikki when she was conservation officer, a lot of the work was about changing the perceptions of city and changing the attitudes from historic spaces and buildings being treated as liabilities and costs, and to there being opportunities. A much more positive image of Fishamble Street. This is the annual celebration of Messiah with the performance of Handel's Messiah on that street, backdrop of the cathedral, and obviously the first phase of the civic offices there beside it. I think the point here is also, given the council's wide-ranging view of how the city is managed, etc. We're built environment professionals, and most of the people here are here because of the built environment, but we have to remember that the people who use the city experience these spaces for different reasons associated with their lives. Cities, buildings, architecture, they're not an end in themselves. They facilitate people, and the thriving of the city. And the city council is unusual. Local authorities are quite unusual amongst public bodies because they have a direct democratic mandate related to the place where they are working specifically. And so the value that the historic buildings bring, and this is again about this perception of what changes, how this perception has changed, is how that enhances the place. These are the matrix for daily life. They're where people set up businesses, where they play music, have celebrations, where they heal, where they learn, and obviously where they live, in housing being probably the dominant typology or building type in the city. Just a little bit of organisational information. When you start to map out the different parts of Dublin City Council that interact with the city, these would be the parts that would have a direct work in historic, in the historic built environment. Key would be planning, conservation, dangerous buildings, which was mentioned, which does have a role in the historic city. Archaeology section, city architects, which is where I would do most of my work, the Parks Department in terms of historic green spaces, the public realm, which draws from across the council in terms of managing the overall network of streets and spaces of the city, the Heritage Office, derelict sites, the Conservation Officer being key as well. And before you're alarmed, I'm not going to run through what every single section of the council does to structure this talk. So what I was thinking instead was to try and focus, rather than the sort of bureaucratic channels that everybody is operating in, to talk instead about some of the outcomes. And there was I was sort of thinking of 4 key outcomes that we all want and I think would share values about in the city. The first would be about understanding, which is really about improving our understanding of the city's history as a key driver of how we shape today's spaces, whether it's through policy, planning, design, or development. I think, no need to tell everybody in the room here about this, but the knowledge and keeping that knowledge alive and disseminating it is key to that. And the real challenge, if that's the opportunity, the real challenge there is how do we make space for that in a crowded, dynamic environment of development. Development is always moving at its own pace with its own multifaceted activities continually going in progress. So we need to have understanding out there. Stewardship is key. We've moved from the phase of destruction, we've moved through the perception, but actually preserving the physical fabric. The challenges that have always been there are about sustainable, fundable uses and lives, and many of the people here I know work with these, and they're, it's an ongoing incremental process. A lot of the buildings that we have, they're smaller scale in the city, but having organisations like, say, the Civic Trust, who can take over buildings and keep them moving, because moving through a system of rejuvenation and ongoing life is really important. There's the process of development, how we develop the city's spaces. And we can focus on these historic buildings and spaces, but we also, the opportunity is to see what else can we achieve in the city at a strategic level for the city, to get the most value out of these, and I'll talk about some of these examples. And then access. The historic city needs to be maintained for everybody to use and visit. The most obvious thing is about its public spaces, which are just the way most people will experience the architecture of the city, the streets and the squares. And most of the interior spaces of the cities are privatized, but the public spaces are how we understand these. And we are learning the importance and value of places, shared places where people can gather. So first of all, some of the recent works on understanding. This is a reconstruction of St. John's Priory. Oh, lost the old mic. Sorry, I'll just hold it. St. John's Priory, which was commissioned by the archaeology section under Dr. Ruth Johnson. And it's in the area which you'd all be familiar with. This is now IMA and the RHK, and it's on the elevated ridge along the Schlie Moor, heading into the city, an extremely strategic location in the city, controlling the western approaches. It also incorporated lands across the river. It was a hugely powerful settlement. And you can see here the Cammock and the crossing into Kilmainham, and actually mill activity here, which continues in the structures to today. So the early origins of these uses that are still maintained today and can be seen. So this is really important work in terms of helping to visualize these for people. And taking it again, this is a project which was led by Nikki as the conservation officer some years back, and I'm mentioning it going back a bit because the Ainger Estate, which Valerie mentioned, and the Priory enclosure from it, is a really identifiable space in the city centre. Everybody knows it. But somehow was this oasis of neglect with a lot of development happening around it. And the work that Nikki and her colleagues did in terms of uncovering hidden stories, hidden architectures, finding a new typology that was previously unknown, uncovering the archaeology of how the street elevations developed. I think people come to the city, they think that these streets were originally just terraces of shops with homes over, whereas actually they were originally freestanding buildings, and picking apart how they were incrementally infilled to create the relatively uniform street walls we have today. And other local heritage, such as this witching bottle for cursing people, which was just excavated within the site. But not just stopping there. This wasn't just about a pure exercise in understanding and uncovering. This was about getting the local community and businesses and stakeholders in the area, such as the Whitefriar Church, the local funeral home, local school, all participating in this. And the question was, how can you take this and bring this into everyday development to help a social and economic regeneration of this historic area of the city? This is the public realm strategy is currently being drafted for the city. It is now long overdue. But this is an extract from the first one, which was in 2012, and taking some of the things that you might recognize, very small there, but the original early settlements and the original pathways through the city was a key part of setting out the rationale for hierarchies of streets in the policy. So this document was an action under the development plan, and it was probably the first time that the city's network of streets were mapped in a way where the hierarchy was not really engineering-led as a transport or movement function, but instead about its social and cultural value. These are the streets that are important to the people. The reason why the two key primary corridors are what's known as the civic spine, referred to in the policy parlance, running from Christchurch along by College Green and then up O'Connell Street to Parnell Square, and the Liffey corridor. So those they aren't standing out strongest because of their transport routes. They're standing out because these are the things that people orientate themselves by in the city, and it gives a rationale to how we see the spaces. And of course the 5 garden squares of the Georgian squares highlighted as key places as well. And I'll be coming back to a hierarchy of spaces was also set out, with College Green there identified as number 1. The remarkable work done by Shaffrey's at number 14 Henrietta Street I think is a hugely important piece of experiencing the building, where the building is telling you the story itself. So to be able to create a place that has that layered history within it, of different states of the building's historic condition, different stages, different reconstructions, the reconstruction of the actual flat there, but the different states of decay. I was familiar with this building from a long time ago, and it was, coming to the council, hugely important. It was great to see when the council had acquired it in order to start preserving it. But really getting buildings to be able to tell them, for the public, to be able to tell their own stories, it's just a remarkable design achievement. In terms of stewardship, the council obviously, this is about maintaining the building itself. The council is maintaining its own properties, and that would be the work closest to home for us. And I see Margaret, who is a key person in leading the current works in the Mansion House, is here. So the Mansion House is a national monument, and work there is always ongoing and incremental. It's also a live, busy public building. It is the home to Lord Mayors. There are very narrow windows when you can actually achieve works. And the work that Margaret and her colleagues do is, Margaret Glupker and her colleagues do, is about uncovering all of these layers of interventions that have happened in the past. There are always surprises when things are opened up. It's amazing how much the building still yields. And the council holds this stock, City Hall, Newcomen Bank, Charlemont House, this stock of these really important buildings for the city. They are the city's estate, directly maintained. Moving into the public realm then, this is a project which is just initiating, which is being led by the Heritage Office under Charles Duggan, who's here. This is a conservation management plan for public sculptures, which is currently in the initiating stages, with consultant architects having been appointed, and contractors then for maintaining these buildings, you can point out. And this will be the first time that these monuments will then have an ongoing management and maintenance, because it's clear to everybody these are hugely important. They have a lot of meaning, especially the parade of memorial statues on O'Connell Street, hugely significant, and having them maintained is really important. So that's something that the council is obviously directly doing. Kilmainham Mill, going back to the reconstruction of the Camach. Kilmainham Mill is a structure that has been acquired, and there has been ongoing stabilisation work, and this is an example of, a bit like number 40 and Henrietta Street, taking buildings directly, doing the important work to stabilise it, and then make it available for uses into the future. So the stabilisation work has included making it available for temporary and ephemeral uses, while there'll be an ongoing work into the future to restore it. The council then is also interacting with private actors and others in the city through indirectly fostering the restoration of buildings. There's the Built Heritage Fund, Historic Structures Fund, which relates to public buildings, and the Community Monuments Fund, which is managed by the archaeology section. The other funds are managed by the conservation planning section. City Architects have also worked in the past on work. The real challenge with these is about how do you leverage the limited funding that's available to get the maximum outcome. And the conservation section are really strong in terms of identifying what was the employment created, what was the other work that took place because this was available. So often these works will be part of something bigger that a building owner is doing. And it could be the difference between making somebody's project to occupy a building in the city, the difference between it being viable or not. So maximising, so has a catalyst role in maximising the output of that is really important. The other thing that's important about this is maintaining skills. The skills in these sectors need to be kept alive. It's specialist work, but the market needs to be expanded as much as possible so that it's viable for people to work in. In terms of development, obviously the city is continually developing, and we've got key historic buildings and spaces, and the real question here, the huge opportunity, is how do we leverage the most out of these for the city? The first is very obvious one. You're probably familiar with this image. This is the current ongoing work for the redevelopment of College Green. And it's really a multifaceted project. You know, it takes place at a really key, this hinge point as you turn from in front of Trinity, from Dame Street, heading north. And, you know, maybe in years past, this could have been a transport project. It's about pedestrianisation, or it's about what we do with cars or something. But the important thing is that this is a key social and cultural space for the city. And what will this space in the round be? You know, the assemblage of buildings, making the space so that you can actually appreciate the assemblage of buildings that are enclosing it. The restoration of this is a place where you can actually spend time in instead of passing through. The alignments where you can, again, with following, I suppose, from the Wide Streets Commissioner, being able to appreciate viewpoints that are just not able to be appreciated currently because of the busyness of the traffic. So that project, obviously, there was a first iteration of this. A lot has unlocked in the intervening years. A lot of understandings of public space are coming out of COVID has changed and enabled a change, and obviously reorganisation of bus connects is a huge issue there, and that has enabled this to be then continue forward as a project. The council is now starting work on the fruit and vegetable market off Cahill Street. COADY Architects have designed the overall building with extending spaces to the south of it to take advantage of disused yards and the southern entrance to the building. And the really important thing about this, again, getting back to what can this do, is that if you look at the location of the city markets in the city, it's at the end of this long Henry Street axis. So at one end you'll have the more commercial sort of department store, fashion type of activities at the O'Connell Street end, hugely important. And then you've got this continuous trail along Henry Street, crossing Cahill Street, along Mary's Place, along Mary Street, and to the city markets, which is planned to be this hub of craft and food. So there's contrasting types of activity there, which I think will really work well with the overall picture of Dublin 1. And then it also makes that connection west towards Smithfield. So again, it's about pulling in areas of the city that can, like, I grew up on the far edges of the city. Smithfield seems really central to me. But you'd be surprised at how many people consider Smithfield to be quite peripheral. So making these connections is really important. So a huge investment in terms of getting this building, and there'll be a huge benefit directly in terms of having this food retail market in the city. But the other benefits are about what change will happen in the district arising out of it. So again, almost like the smaller scale of the grant funding, it's about how do you get the most out of the investments that you make. Another big investment in a historic building here is Rutland Street School in the northeast inner city off Schoenberg-Dermot Street. People may be familiar with this or not. It was the site of the recording of Give Up Your Old Sins in the 1960s. It was known locally as the Red Brick Slaughterhouse, so it has a mixed perception in the district. It was a tough school. Where this project has really come out of is that in 2016 the Mulvin report came out, which was to address, it was a response and a report to the government on actions to be taken on organised crime in the northeast inner city area. And what I found really inspiring about that report was that something that was focused on, you know, a societal issue actually had as one of its key strands the regeneration of the physical realm. So there were 4 key actions of that report that came out, and one of them was about the need to do more with the historic buildings and the historic streets of the district. A task force was set up arising out of this. The place is very dramatically different from what it was in 2016. There's a lot of greening has been put into the district. Buildings have been brought back. There's ongoing investment. Nearby, there's the national project being led by the OPW for the National Centre for Reconciliation in the former Magdalen Laundry. And this project here is about taking this building, which the reconstruction has been designed by COADY Architects, and redeveloping it as a community hub. So there's a lot of community groups in the areas, organisations like the Lourdes Youth and Community Services and other groups, and they will all be consolidated into this building in one hub, which will be a key active place for the district. This is a project in the Crumlin-Drimna area along Crumlin Road, where there was a protected structure, a former scolena, on a site which was somewhat residual to a housing scheme. So the site was there because a housing site was acquired next door for a housing development that the council was undertaking, but is now being redeveloped as a library. This just earlier this year achieved planning permission and is being brought forward. And the existing original school building is going to be it will be meeting rooms and learning rooms as part of the library. And the spaces around it, which were a derelict unused school, will be will be revitalised. So other work here is about activation of sites. This is Riders Row at the end of Capel Street and Parnell Street, and this is where the council, the property was actually in different titles, and this is something that actually plagues a lot of properties in the city centre. Title can be really complicated, and so the council can intervene to acquire the sites, put them all into one title, and then that makes it viable for somebody then to develop it. And the work that we do is actually about exploring and showing, providing feasibilities and showing potentials, working with the planning department in terms of what is the envelope of development that could be achieved here. And this has a value that you're adding to the site by de-risking for developers, because there's a degree of certainty about what can be achieved, and we can start to examine clearly what is viable. A lot of sites in the city centre, they're complicated shapes, they have that issue with title, so being able to simplify and clarify things is really important, and then add that value so that they can be taken on by others. The site also contains a national monument, which is what remains of the national monument here, which will need to be integrated into whatever proposals arise. This is another property the council acquired, number 41 Parnell Square, and again carrying out feasibility studies for potential affordable key worker housing, which may be accommodated within it. So again, it's sort of looking at the building. You're constantly looking for what uses will sustain it into the future, and it intersects with current issues of the housing shortage in the city, which is one of the city's biggest policy priorities. I'm going to finish up by talking about access, because a key, the big thing about this city is that it is available to be experienced, and the more people who are able to experience it, the greater the value that it's thereby giving. The importance of the city spaces is, I think, with the splintering of the digital public realm that we've seen, where there's no more a shared media landscape, where everything is fragmenting into echo chambers. Public spaces as places that people can meet, experience others together, hugely important. So that's a big part of the public spaces in the city. But aside from that, there's the everyday access to the city, which is hugely important. The COVID crisis really unlocked a lot about how we use city spaces. Suddenly things that appeared impossible for that suddenly were doable. And a completely changed attitude, a changed public attitude in terms of where people want to spend their time. I mean, the sight of people just out here, all of the young people, even though the pubs were closed, the way they appreciated the street was really important. So the work, this here is what you might call tactical urbanism, which arose out of, really almost directly out of the COVID pandemic. And this is the former, this is Cahill Street, formerly filled with cars. When I was studying, this had 2 lanes of traffic, reduced to 1, but with 2 lanes of parking. Overwhelming public support for its pedestrianisation. The street has always been in a state of transition. The businesses are dynamic. The picture of the businesses continually changes. But a lot of the businesses that are there now require and appreciate public space. And then the greening that has been put in, some of it where possible goes into the ground, where not possible goes into large containers that can sustain themselves. And you can see how people are, it was extremely quiet at the start, but it's now, really fully occupied during weekdays. South Anne Street, the South Anne Street network is just started on site. And this is, again, this is more of a permanent solution, not like Cahill Street, which has been put in incrementally. This is a long-standing project, which is the next phase of the Grafton Street quarter. So the work done around Chatham Street, Clarendon Row, etc. was the first part. The project started with Grafton Street itself in 2013. So phase by phase, the historic street has been repaved with granite. Sustainable urban drainage has been put in, planting, and really importantly, being reimagined as places for lingering and spending time. So seating in places where you'd never have seen it before, and spaces for just being in the city. And probably the biggest part of work that has gone into this, though, is about access. So access to the city's diverse population is really important. There's children, older people, and people with disabilities. So this project went through a very rigorous process following the UN Charter on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which involves consultation right from the outset before you even design anything. And the Charter sets out that any interventions, any public investments that will affect people with disabilities must be consulted sufficiently with them. So that involved, first of all, the pre-design consultations about the general approach to things and getting an understanding. All of the material, all of the digital material and physical material was produced in accessible formats that people with different abilities could understand. So for example there, that's a tactile model which we have used on this and actually on other projects as well. Direct review of materials. And then, obviously, to come in this case, post-project consultation, so that we're continually learning. And the important thing there is that this is not just a consultation process. The designs are better because we actually went through this process. And designs in the future, I think, what has happened with having to manage access in older buildings, the change in attitudes there over time, people can see that more accessible buildings are better for everybody. And this is Cahill Brewer Street, which is currently going just off O'Connell Street. One of my favourite small spaces in the city. And this is currently going through that same process as well, because we've got a long-standing chain of projects down through Cahill Brewer Street, Cathedral Street, all those side streets connecting Marlborough Street and O'Connell Street on an ongoing basis. So I suppose that's it. I'm done. And I would just leave you, I suppose, the last outcome, and again, thank you for this day, because this is part of it, is about inspiration, about inspiring change going forward. And you know, the work that people in this room do in terms of that is hugely important to the future of the city as it develops and will continue to grow.
Thank you very much, Owen. It's fascinating to hear firsthand of the works the City Council is currently doing, the works it has underway that are being planned. That I very much look forward to seeing what's achieved with the fruit and vegetable market, with the Main Mill. Rider Row, I remember what, 20 years ago, Paul Arnold is somewhere in the road, but Paul was involved to a certain degree with a building that's fallen into that the national monument has fallen into such a state of decay that had to be, I remember the term being used, dismantled. I don't know if that's new architect over there, but I'll continue chatting whilst we are going ahead. But I'm very pleased now to be introducing the next two speakers, David Browne and Jim COADY, who are going to be talking on Irish cities in crisis, pride issues, Galway 2070 study, and some thoughts about Dublin in crisis. Shall I pass over to you?
Absolutely.
Great, good.
David and I are going to talk about the work of a voluntary group that got together pre-COVID and have been discussing Irish cities ever since. The presentation will be in 3 parts. Irish Cities in Crisis. We then wrote a book, having talked about things for about 4 years, and we'll talk about the prime issues in that book. We'll talk about a seminal study we did of Galway, and it was really an intention to talk about the importance of urban design rather than two-dimensional planning. And we think that the outcome of that is applicable to all of our towns and cities. And finally, David will talk about issues about Dublin. The Irish Cities Group, approximately 35 people, multidisciplinary, supported by the RIAI and also by the Academy of Engineering. The disciplines cover architecture, engineering, urban design, planning, demography, lots else. Been talking since about 2020, primarily about how we go about making change in cities, but also how to implement those changes. We believe that the island, might increase from 7.5 to in excess of 11 million in the next 50 years. And if it is, we need good cities in which to place those people if we're going to attract them at all. We also talk in our book and in our kind of conversations about models for city centres and densification of suburbs, and how our cities might grow, most of all, how our cities might grow compactly. We need to recognise that we have a crisis as far as urban development is concerned. Valerie talked about the manner in which the medieval, but then largely the planned city of the 18th and 19th centuries happened. Our system does not work. We do believe that our planning system cannot provide, in its current form, the needed guidance for that kind of development, which we think could be really, truly radical. National and urban infrastructure, we all know, is in great difficulty. We've underestimated population growth for the last approximately 15 years. We need to plan big, not in terms of knocking things down, but planning for all of the aspects of our urban future. And most of all, I think we need a coordinated national plan. The people of Copenhagen have a very clear view of what their city is about. The five-finger plan has guided them since about the mid-1940s. It remains current today. The relationship with nature, the relationship with the sea, the importance of public transport, the way in which the individual fingers have developed along transport routes, all those things are key to people's understanding. They know what they're going to have. We need to respond very firmly to climate change. All of our 5 cities are on coastal locations and subject to coastal and fluvial flooding in the future. We need to densify our suburbs and provide a city of short distances and get away from the kind of suburban miasma that has spread on the edges of all of our cities. And to guide all of this, we need training and research. Many people here will remember on Forest Forborough, it disappeared. We do need that kind of central view of what urban research we need to do and have it carried out. Transformative city planning and urban design can be delivered, we think, by dismantling the silos in local, regional, and throughout governance we have silos. We need to redraw the regions to approximately give 700,000 people to each of those and a city at its core. We need leadership to guide our local authorities and our regional authorities. They simply don't have the resources at the moment. And most of all, rather than building suburbs, we need to build neighbourhoods and communities. Public transport and the routes for that must be clearly established and held open, and we need first-class sustainable architecture to complement good urban planning. Housing for the future. Well, we need approximately 62,000 dwellings to be built per year for the next 10 years. We need to build apartments rather than houses. We need increased state involvement in the planning and urban design and infrastructure. In Vienna, approximately 60% of all the dwellings in the city are in some way subsidized or aided by the public purse. We've got to do energy refits in approximately 1.2 million dwellings, and 100,000 dwellings remain vacant in the 2022 census. There has been an implied right to dwellings throughout the state's history, but it's a time, we think now, to actually say we must provide a dwelling for each person that needs one, and show a right for that to happen. And common good, rather than the private interest, must be the touchstone of planning into the future. So we need a paradigm shift. I won't go through the first points here, but we are at a tipping point, we believe, and we need to future-proof Ireland into its future. If we are going to have approximately half as many people more in 50 years' time than we have living on the island today, we need to plan it, design it, and build it. Common good as the touchstone, and this idea of a visionary national plan, something which people can really understand, that citizenry throughout the country can really understand. Much of this is in our book. The first book we did was approximately 650 pages. The reduced version, available online through the RIAI website, is noted here and available to everybody free. Galway was taken as our kind of focus project to kind of prove or to establish the kind of ideas that we had about the future cities. In that, we looked at European exemplars. We looked at Galway City in 2070. We looked particularly at how we develop neighbourhoods and a touch of how it happens to the inner city. And we think the lessons from Galway can apply to all of our cities. Again, this is an approach. It's not a firm plan for Galway. Study of European exemplars was a large part of the ongoing work. We think that this is a description of what is possible, but it is, of course, something to be worked through in detail by the citizenry of Galway, by our regional authorities, and by our national government. Galway is a university city. It's got approximately 86,000 people. Of that, 25,000 are students. It's famous for its urban sprawl. It's famous also for being a very vital city. Galway has increased in population by a factor of 3 in 50 years. A factor of 3 in 50 years. Applying our thoughts to Galway, the primary road network here of Galway is illustrated. The red line is the urban limit, the city limit. Within that, you can see in the middle, the grid squares here are approximately 1 kilometre by 1 kilometre. The bit in the middle, city centre, with tight urban streets. Very quickly, the grid of access from one street, from one road, from one avenue to another, as you move into the suburbs, becomes a 2 metre by 1 metre, 2 kilometre by 1 kilometre grid. This is simply not a city, it simply is a collection of suburbs strung out. And this is represented here by the density, the core in the middle, as you can see quite clearly, the river coming north-south, the sea on the front, the sea edges, this wonderful location that Galway has. And this grey area is just suburbs that go on and on, starting in Victorian times and continuing today. The university in blue, the extraordinary thing that Galway has, the development of its central units or central functions running out in that sort of blue area that runs out from city centre all the way out to the very edge. An extraordinary conclusion. So what might happen? As I mentioned, Galway, approximately 86,000 people, 44,000 jobs, of which half are taken up by people that come in from outside every day. So only half of those that work in Galway live in Galway. The rest live in the area beyond, coming in primarily by car, and there are 31,000 dwellings. If Galway were to expand at twice its current gross density by a factor of 3 in the next 50 years, that is the kind of expansion that is needed. This is clearly impossible. It could not, should not happen. What might happen instead? Well, a city where we would densify our suburbs, a city where every opportunity would be taken for the development of brownfield sites and greenfield sites, all held within an urban growth boundary of the new orbital route running across from east to west. That city could barely grow outside its current limits and be occupied by 3 times the people. It would require that those areas that are shown here in the hatching, these are the greenfield and brownfield sites, will be developed at approximately 75 dwellings per hectare. That's approximately 4 times the current density of Galway. The space taken up by an individual dwelling over the last 40 years in Galway has gone up by a factor of 6. So a dwelling that in 40 years ago, one person or a family occupied now uses 6 times as much space. That's the cost of suburbanization. So in the future, the public transport network, we would begin to pull away all of the traffic coming into the city, parking in the park and ride stations here shown in those big black spots. The railway would provide perhaps 2 new commuter stations, and then a very comprehensive bus service providing a bus stop within 400 metres of everybody living in Galway would provide a grid of bus networks running across the whole of the city. But active transport by walking, by cycling, taking a scooter, or taking public transport would be the primary means of movement through Galway if this densification we speak of could happen. So you have the orbital route across, you have the park and ride stations, and here we show a grid of secondary and tertiary streets and tree-lined streets that would eventually irrigate these suburban areas that are at the moment at such low density, allowing for pretty much all of Galway to double its density in any particular suburb. That's excluding the more dense development that could and should occur in the brownfield and greenfield sites. But of course, if you have 3 times as many people, if we now have 250,000 people rather than 85 or 86,000, we need extra green space. The relationship of the orbital route to the landscape outside it would first of all act as an urban growth boundary. The park and ride stations are those black spots, and then in association with each of these we would see major recreation centres which would use the green space beyond as its sort of primary driving characteristic. And within the city, new parks, green streets, and a very different approach. All of the 3 main dark green city parks expanded and connected much better to their hinterlands, and connected much better also to the river and to the sea. And to begin to develop community and neighbourhood, we found within Galway, we established approximately 41 of these neighbourhood centres, or neighbourhoods, character areas, areas that currently have some definition of particularity. But if we were to densify all of this in the way we would like to, we would need to build approximately 27 new primary schools, 18 new post-primary schools, and 18 primary care centres as principal government interventions within these places. We think all of these should be located close together. Not every character area would have one of these, but it must be adjacent, close by to you. This is not easy. We're not talking here about a simple thing to do. This is very difficult. And you can imagine it requires a kind of planning that we simply do not do at the moment, a kind of urban design that we do not do either. And apart from those 41 centres that I mentioned, these would be the neighbourhood centres, approximately 8 larger centres. These would be district centres providing locations for hospitals, locations for secondary schools, etc. 8 of those, 4 on each side. This would give a kind of urban character and a kind of structure to Galway that currently is suburban once you leave the main core. And how might that kind of densification occur within an existing area? This is Renmore. And we removed access barriers between particular parts of Renmore, one from the next. Then looking at corner sites, looking at backlands, looking at green edges, and looking at infill sites, and looking at obsolescence over this 50-year period, we believe we can double the density of residential occupation in Renmore in that period of time without really changing the aspect of the neighbourhood as people currently appreciate it. And these dark spaces are the kind of buildings that we are suggesting that might be distributed across the area. But obsolescence alone will mean that approximately 0.5% of dwellings each year become obsolete. So taken over 50 years, that will give you approximately 25% of this area will become obsolete and will itself contribute to the potential to densify. But if we do it, we have to plan it and we have to urban design it. And also there are green areas, current areas that are not occupied in Galway. This is the area directly below the railway line, between the railway line and the sea. And our suggestion is that this could be developed as 3 new urban villages, retaining all the current recreational uses that are in the area and linking each of those back up to major green spaces currently part of the city. And the kind of shape that might take is illustrated here and in 3 dimensions. I'm going to leave the inner city to David.
Sorry folks, Jim and I have been a double act for a few years, so. So looking at the inner city, Jim and I did a survey back in 21 and we had a good look around the city over several days, and it has a great use mix with a very vibrant tourism offer, as we all know. There is a need to revive its cultural offer. There are no significant development sites with the exception of all these car parks. There's an intact if faltering buildings and public realm and a surprisingly low number of vacant upper stories. And it has great potential for a pedestrian dominant core area. What can we do with the city? Well, we think we could, because there are so few development sites around it, we think we can consolidate around the core. For example, how does this thing work? For example, the Headford Road area that we all know with all these retail stores could be consolidated into a 6 or 8 story neighbourhood. And there are plenty of other areas of potential. And perhaps in time we could use the car parks to relocate the large retail from out of town back into the city, which is what we've seen in cities like Freiburg. And again, there is great potential for a pedestrian dominant city area really going from Eyre Square all the way in, as has been done in places like Freiburg. So just look, some thoughts about Dublin. Just it's worth remembering Dublin is the engine of the Irish economy, the intersection between national and global networks and economic systems. It's the political centre and it does generate half of the country's GDP. but it is falling behind in areas of governance, spatial coherence, legibility, strategic transport, housing, and the rest. What needs to be done? We're thinking we need to reconsider the Dublin regional subdivision. Do we need a greater Dublin authority over the 4 existing councils? That's a very, very important point that people need to think about. We need stronger, open and clearly understood leadership for Dublin and its region. And you know, as has happened in Limerick, would an elected mayor to govern the city and fight for it be the right thing to do? It might be. It was very interesting. We were in Helsinki last month, and they do not have an elected mayor. They are elected by the council, but they've got much greater power, and the city within the country has much greater autonomy because it has the power to raise its own tax, which doesn't happen here in Dublin. And then Jim has talked about better planning, mainstreaming 3D development, and then using the proposed new UDZ development plans, which would develop areas of the city in 3D to make it more coherent and to aid the planning process. Again, Jim has talked about movement and infrastructure, and you know, I think we all know what needs to be done about that. Sorry, I'm moving quite quickly because of the time constraint. In terms of a long-term vision, Dublin does have to plan in the context of 11 million people on the island in 2070. We will have somewhere between 1.8 and 2.35 million people by 2070, and we need a vision for that. One of the things we're thinking is you know, there is the city edge, there's the potential of the port, there's the potential of the areas up in Finglas, Glasnevin. They could contribute greatly along with the idea of suburban densification that Jim has described and the use of brownfield sites. And I think the revitalisation of the city centre to accommodate all of the population growth that we're going to experience. I had 3 examples here, Copenhagen, Malaga and Freiburg, but I'm just going to look at Freiburg. In each of those cities, instead of piecemeal pedestrianisation, which of course is welcome, they had a greater vision, and over 10-year periods, they pedestrianised the entire centre city rather than bits and pieces of it. And I believe that is a strategy that will help both to enliven the city for visitors and daily users, but also make it much more attractive for living in for the future. Because I mean, the city is basically vastly underutilised, and we really need to think of ways of reviving it. So that's Freiburg, which is, as you can say, that's a kilometre square almost. But if we take Dublin, and it was very interesting to hear the work that Owen described. But what if we said, look, let's just go for pedestrianising a big tract, and this is just obviously the north side. The same would occur on the south side. What if we looked at within a 10-year period, envisioning how are we going to do this, and it is possible, and the benefits in places like Freiburg and Malaga have been enormous. I was in Malaga in the 1990s, and it was a dump, and it is now the most vibrant, lively, incredible city. I love going to it, and I go there a lot. A few general points. I think we've talked about the design and quality of the public realm, reducing car dominance, healing fragmented public realm. We have a lot of work to do there. We have a lot of work in addressing our infrastructure shortcomings. And then the idea that we need to repurpose our mono-use neighbourhoods to encourage mixed-use development and revitalising our streets. This one is interesting. Different cities use either carrot or stick or a mixture of both to incentivise building owners to maintain their buildings. Berlin offers grants and low-interest loans for the restoration of historic buildings. On the other hand, Paris has stringent building codes and heritage protection laws which mandate regular maintenance, with significant fines for non-compliance. Barcelona combines financial incentives with community engagement and funds neighbourhood improvements. Milan gives tax deductions for facade renovations. I think that kind of thinking could be very helpful in bringing up the quality of the buildings that surround our streets, which are in many cases very poor at the moment. And I think we also need to think, we have all these magnificent Georgian buildings, but family sizes are now 2.7 people, so we need to be thinking about how can we get multiple units sensitively into these. You walk through London, you walk through Malaga, you walk through Freiburg, the lower streets or the lower levels are all retail or restaurants or whatever, but the upper levels are all lived in, and the city has a vibrance as a consequence, and we really need to be pushing that. And then, there are some great examples. You have obviously the big examples of the large buildings on. I've that much time, have I? I've gone too fast. I'm nearly at the end. Anyway, there is reusing the underused Georgian and Victorian building upper floors. There's living over the shop, and Capel Street provides a great example of that's ready-made if we could start occupying the upper levels. And then that again has the great benefit of helping security in the city centre, because now we have streets that are continuously overlooked. And I think, the key to me, pedestrianisation is great, but the real key is consolidating inner city residential living in the city, and it's a real goal I think we need to aim for. And that's it. Thank you very much.
What we're going to do is we can take a few questions at this point in time, and then if we have further questions, we can move those to the end of the next session. So our speakers are all up at the front. Does anybody want to ask a question at this point in time? I'm going to think mic here, we shouldn't. Hopefully not cause too much feedback. Great.
Good morning, thank you all for the interesting presentations. The earliest citation I could find for living above or over the shop is in the Irish Times in 1999. So something is stopping this happening with such a great idea. So can we rehearse what those obstacles are and perhaps how they might be removed?
I think cost is one of the big issues. It's the big issue. It's very hard to come in. I know from personal experience, my over renovated. Is this open? I know from personal experience that my daughter we renovated the house in Peter Square, and it certainly ate up a lot of money. I think we need to look at how can we incentivize both developers and owner-occupiers and tenants to come and live in the city. I know there's a lot of talk about not encouraging tax incentives, etc., but somehow money needs to be added to the mix to make these things happen. We actually have a crisis, and if we don't start thinking in those terms, I don't believe we can.
Can I just add that? I think you're absolutely right. We do need incentives, but also I think we're over-regulated as a society. We do. And I think if you look at the statistics from the fire department, most people now die in road accidents. They do not die in house fires. So we've made our houses very safe, very good. But I know from my own experience of working as an architect to try and add, to try and say divide a house in Mountjoy Square, which we tried to do some time ago, into say an apartment or a series of apartments on each floor is very difficult because of the involvement of the fire department. And I think all of this is something where your help would be really valued in this, because I think we all went through this in the 80s about trying to get the fire departments to be more responsive, and we seem to be not going backwards, particularly
in places like London, we do have a 700mm wide staircase. They would take a view that instead of making you take it out, we should put in extra fire detection and smoke detection, inspect it regularly to make So there are ways of being proactive around these things.
Sorry, good morning, Ian Shields, Architect. On exactly the same topic, my belief is that, and I know that it was interesting to phone on this circles of what happened in Dublin City Council. The civil access people were not mentioned on that, and fire department were not mentioned on that. And as Valerie just said, I mean, these are people that we were up against where things can't happen. I had an experience some years ago on a fairly important building, not residential as it happened, but an important protected structure, where there was a difference of opinion between the disabled access people and the conservation side. I agree with the conservation side of what they wanted to do. It was simply putting a lift, external lift, going up 10 steps to get in the first place. And we were converting this building back to a very welcome use from the conservation and planning side point of view. But I was refused a disabled access certificate by that side. And before we got to that point, I had said to them, could we maybe sit down and talk with conservation people, talk to yourself, talk to me, talk to our client, see what we can do. And I was told, and I quote exactly what I was told by the DAC people, we don't talk to those people, talk about the conservation people. Now, so long as people say we didn't do silence and don't talk to people and don't see themselves as part of the solution, they're going nowhere much. We really are not. What happened there? I ended up going to Borcanora. 6 months later, I got my DSC. 6 months later, we're nothing except people wouldn't talk to each other.
Corporation have very strong legislative powers as regards buildings, but they don't use them, and I don't know why. They should use them. To give you an example, Eton Key, which is absolutely terrible in a capital city, from the main street, is a building there called the Mercantile Marina. It's been vacant for about 30 years, and it's finally vacant. There's so much dirt on the windows that the drone should. And the corporation, city council, they're not using each other, but we don't know why. And I think we should be told why, but they're not exercising.
Do any of the speakers want to respond to that?
Okay. Well, without talking about specific cases, when disabled access came in, it was always a challenge about how buildings would be treated and historic buildings. There have to be, I don't know the question of communications between different sections, but no, it is important that where managed solutions can be used and it's appropriate that they can be utilised. I do know that it can come down legislatively to, as was explained to me by the FRIAI, they actually have different legislations. There was a very impressive fire officer who since unfortunately passed away, who was a conservation officer conservation architect as well as being a fire officer. And so there's a difference between a building that achieves compliance on day one because you never go back to inspect it, or where you have the ability to go in as a fire service to actually continue make inspections so they can actually inspect whether management solutions can be implemented or not in the fire service.
I'm talking about derelict buildings.
Sorry, I was coming back to this. On the Derelict Sites Act, I think part of the issue there is about there can be time taken. First of all, it's about engaging with the owners. Different parts of the council do engage with owners, say continuous buildings, continuous building section of wood, engage with owners informally, so you may not see notice being issued, but the owner would be contacted about particular issues. That might be at hand. And in terms of derelict sites, there is engagement happening on a wider range than you can see for buildings formally happening at that particular building that you're mentioning there. Another issue, though, that has been experienced is sometimes buildings, there can be an opaqueness to the legal ownership. So there can be a case where you're serving notices and then you have to go through a lengthy period to serve notice, period of response to serve notice. And then it can be quite late in the day transpired that this is not valid owner, this is a different person. And you start the process again. I'm aware of it because that has happened in the past. There can also be other places where there is some requirement of the person could be a ward of court, or for some other reason is not available to manage the property and act on behalf of the property. So there can be legal impediments there. Is one issue, and I think there needs to be more. I think I agree. There is too much neglect of properties around. When we were doing the first public land strategy, and we did consultations on street, and the big feedback actually wasn't the physical property that counted, like the horizontal surface. It was actually the condition of buildings along a lot of these streets. So no, there needs to be more done, but I think there's also more engagement happening that may be appearing in the registries now.
Can't hear you. Sorry, can you hear me now? I know from work I was doing on towns that the very encouraging thing that's happening lately is that you're beginning to see compulsory purchase orders or vacant site notices appearing on houses that are just in the middle of the street, been vacant for years, and obviously been a probate problem and some legal ownership at a certain point. And I'm looking more detail at this, but incorporated by the city council or the county councils have a right to actually take over those properties. I think that needs to be enforced more in the city, because a few of those would set a bit of trap.
Yeah, just to say some of the examples that were actually cases when the council has taken over buildings which were derelict, and it was a CPO process, so number 14 initially arrived at the council that way. Number 41, Riders Row, so there's obviously a question of resources, but there are other councils around the country also who are very proactive in directly taking over. And then once you take over, obviously councils are going to visit what use they can make of these buildings. So it's going to be that how you get private investment to take them on. Again, that comes back to that question of sustainable funding. Who can get use to building that was sustainable funding? It's quite a good example around the corner here. There's a building. Susan Roundtree, who formerly worked in the council, and I think it's number 42 Angel Street, and we did many iterations of feasibility studies. What can be done with this property? Eventually, it's acquired, and it's very successful. The business car, the Lucky Duck, ground floor, it's a fully occupied understory building. So getting those kind of uses fund the restoration of the building. But that was a perfect example. Corner-wise, we're heading northwards along Angel Street, very prominent street location. So they do happen, but there's questions on resources, how often